everyone for coming out today. We're going to move things along and hopefully have enough time for questions, pushback, what have you. Hopefully my voice holds up. So let's kind of begin in the middle. I know, but I don't want to have the slides open yet. So I'm going to show a short video clip. Some of you might know that Roy Moore was a candidate for Congress last year in a special election. Judge Moore had some controversial views. One of those was that a Muslim could not serve in U.S. Congress, and this is his campaign manager explaining why a Muslim could not serve in U.S. Congress.
Judge Moore has also said that he doesn't think a Muslim member of Congress should be allowed to be in Congress. Why? Under what provision of the
Because you have to
Constitution?
swear on the Bible. When you are before, I had to do it. I'm an elected official, 3 terms. I had to swear on the Bible. You have to swear on the Bible to be an elected official in the United States of America. He alleges that a Muslim cannot do that ethically, swearing on the Bible.
You don't actually have to swear on a Christian Bible. You can swear on anything, really. I don't know if you knew that. You can swear on a Jewish Bible.
Oh no,
You can
I
swear
swore on the Bible. I've done it 3 times.
I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've picked a Bible, but the law is not that you have to swear on a Christian Bible. That is not the law. All right, Ted Crockett.
I don't know. I know that Donald Trump did it when he was president.
Because he's Christian and he picked it. That's what he wanted to. That's what he wanted to swear in on. Ted Crockett with the Moore campaign. Good luck tonight. Thank you so much for being here. My panel will react when we
Merry
get back.
Christmas, Jack.
Thank you, sir.
So some of you might be wondering why start out with this title. This isn't the way that this conversation is usually framed. This is the question that's usually taken up and debated, particularly in circles like ours, right? I want to suggest that we already know the answer to this. It's a quite simple proposition. Was America founded as a Christian nation? No. Now, I realize that some of you might be thinking, well, doesn't that kind of depend on what we mean by certain words? Christian nation, right? That's kind of a loose concept. So doesn't really matter. Does it matter what people mean? Is there some ways in which we could say we are a Christian nation? I would still say no. Wherever somebody begins when they utter the words, America was founded as a Christian nation, whatever they might mean, they always end up in the same place. And that place is that Christians have some kind of special hold or special place in the United States. We have some special claim on this country. The Constitution could not be any clearer on that point. So many of the debates about is America a Christian nation circulate around the meaning of the First Amendment. Look, that's not a part of the original Constitution. It's an amendment to the Constitution. If you want to know what the founders actually meant, you have to look at the actual Constitution and what it says about religion. And what you see in the Constitution is that it doesn't say that much. Our Constitution quite literally is godless. Not anti-religious, mind you, but godless in the sense the word God never appears in this document. About the impact of religion in American politics, in America's founding, in this whole debate, is America a Christian nation or not, should begin with Article 6 of the Constitution. So here it is. Article 6 gives us two important things, 2 important concepts. There in the middle, you can kind of see the bold text. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. This is what we call the Supremacy Clause. What Congress does, what the federal government does, is supreme law of the land. The states can't do anything counter to federal law. And it's interesting that Madison, when he designed this, decided to put the only mention of religion in the Constitution, the original Constitution, in alignment with the Supremacy Clause. But here you have it. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So not only is our Constitution literally godless, the only mention of religion in the original document isn't in a negative way. Congress can't establish any religious tests for office. Now, one way we could say this is that our Constitution guarantees a secular state, right? That's how you could understand that. But secular does carry some kind of negative connotations with it. So if you would prefer multi-religious, unaffiliated, right? No religious test for office means no religious test for office. Means nobody needs to swear to a Protestant sect or to Catholicism or to Islam or Judaism or even an atheist. Yes, there were atheists in the 18th century, and that was all at this time. This was all taken into consideration by James Madison. He had just kind of on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, who left him high and dry, and went to run around Paris with a bunch of women. Madison is left to kind of fight these religious liberty fights in Virginia, and he wins for a pretty strict conception of religious liberty, establishing Virginia as a secular state. And 2 years later, now having to do this on a national level, he wasn't having it. And so Article 6 is really unambiguous, that the Constitution establishes, again, whatever term you want to prefer, a secular or a multi-religious state, but certainly not a Christian state. The Constitution couldn't be any clearer on this issue. So, if that's the case, and the issue is settled, and one of the reasons I want to get through this kind of quickly is to give you time to, provide what you've learned in Sunday school or your Christian. I went to a Christian day school, so give you opportunity to just kind of push back with things that you've heard. So it's one of the reasons I want to move through this. But one of the things I would like to do with this presentation is shift the terms of debate. I don't think we need to be taking up any more of the question, was America founded as a Christian nation? I think people who are making that claims, and I'll get to this, are not making historical statements, they're making political statements. I think that's a political statement. America was founded as a Christian nation. I think that the evidence is uniformly clear. We were not established. So the question then really has to become a little, why do so many people think that it is? Why do we think America was founded as influence or no presence at the time? And that historically is false as well too. Saying that our founding fathers were not Christian, they were deists or this thing, is this really an overreach? The reality is that most of our leadership at the time were Christians. They weren't evangelicals. They wouldn't be hanging out with you at worship. In fact, if you invited George Washington to chapel, he'd probably get up and run out of there and think you're a bunch of freaks. He was an Anglican, and most of our founding fathers were Anglican, members of the Church of England. A very different conception of Christianity. But this also gave George Washington a different sense of the relationship between religion and political life than, say, maybe James Madison. Madison had a more negative, we'll talk about him in a second, but George Washington tended to have a more favorable view towards religious influence in public life. So Washington's farewell address. The closest thing you get to American scripture, besides the Constitution, is Washington's farewell address. Americans took his advice so seriously that every time Congress opened throughout the 19th century, the farewell address was reread into Congress every time. Maybe we should kind of restart that practice. But this is part of his farewell address. I'm not going to read. I'll let you kind of skim through it. But what Washington is getting at in this section is the idea that religion is essential for good civic life. It's essential for good politics in an indirect kind of way. Washington, like most of our framers, were Republicans. Don't think of the Republican Party. They were 18th century Republicans. They weren't Democrats. What's the difference? Republicans believed that for good government to be maintained, people, or at least leaders, they kind of debated that issue, had to be virtuous. Do I have any 141 survivors in here? Don't want to admit it. Can you remember all the way back? What did virtue mean in the 18th century?
Common good.
What's that?
Common good.
Common good, yeah. A virtuous person was somebody who sacrifices their personal good for the public interest, as it was called, or more commonly today, the common good. A republic had to maintain virtue of its people, or at least its leaders. This is what Washington is getting at in his address here, is that religion is essential for good government because religion produces good moral people. And those good moral people then make for a good civic life, right? It's an indirect way in which religion was seen as influential in American politics. Washington goes so far, you can I kind of highlighted this here, to say that religion is so important that we probably should even work it into some of our religious oaths. Let it be simply asked whether the security of property or reputation of life and a sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice. I read this and I'm like, Washington, you do not read, you were there for Article 6 of the Constitution, right? No religious tests for office, and here you're coming along and saying, no, we need religion to support the oaths. And if you read it carefully, what he seems to be saying is, well, not that office holders, he's not saying office holders should have to offer a religious oath. But he's saying instead that when you go to testify in court against somebody, there he's saying we probably should have them swear in a Bible and swear so help me God and what have you. Washington, for as best as we know, did respect Article 6. There's one of the great debates about this question of religion and the founding is, did George Washington add the phrase, so help me God, to the presidential oath when he took it? If you read the presidential oath in the Constitution, it does not include so help me God. But a story developed about 60 years after this event that said that Washington did say, so help me God. And historians have been debating back and forth. I would tend to side with those who would say there's no documentary evidence from that time to suggest that Washington actually said, so help me God. So he probably didn't. But the myth that he did meant that presidents after that time, all the way up to Barack Obama, do say, so help me God, even though it's not there in the original Constitution. But Washington, like many of the founders, believed that religion was important for public life. It was good to support religion because religion made virtuous people, and virtuous people for good. Virtuous people helped maintain good government in the United States. So religion does play a political role, but only in an indirect kind of way. I should say that, I just need to add this in as an aside, even given Article 6, I think a lot of Americans were so kind of more on Washington's side of things that they couldn't imagine the strict separation of religion and politics that Madison was calling for. While there was never any federal establishment of religion, several states into the 1800s did maintain their religious establishments. Massachusetts, the Congregational Church, was the official church of Massachusetts until the 1830s. You did, in Massachusetts, have to swear religious oaths. You did have to pay taxes to support the Congregational Church. So there was kind of a disconnect, right? The Supremacy Clause should have said, no, the secular nature of the U.S. Constitution should apply to the states. The states were like, well, we're kind of more with George Washington here. It's really hard for us to imagine our people being virtuous without a state church, right? It was kind of a new thing in the world. We've kind of become accepting of it, but it took some people a little bit harder time, particularly those New Englanders. It took them a little bit harder time to give up their religious establishment. I just found this out while I was reading today. There are still 8 states in the United States today that require public office holders to swear an oath of religious belief. In 8 of these states, I don't remember all of them, Pennsylvania and Tennessee are 2 of them, you can't be an atheist and hold office in those states. Now, is it actually enforced? There's no way. Some of these laws, they just continue to exist on the books. There's no way to enforce them because it's a clear violation of Article 6 of the Constitution. But still, they're there, right? So this is not some kind of, ancient history lesson. This George Washington, we need religion in public life to maintain virtuous persons. There is something to that. On the other side, countering your George Washingtons was your James Madison, kind of channeling the spirit of Thomas Jefferson from France. They were pretty much on the same page in terms of wanting a very robust religious liberty and a more strict separation of church and state. And it's because they could look at the history of Europe and see that when churches assumed political power, when Christians assumed political power, it didn't end well. Mixing religion and politics seemed to make matters worse. Now, none of you would have any experience with this, but religious people are not always the nicest getting along kind of people, but sometimes they fight with each other and they get upset over issues, and they fight about doctrine and whether a flag should be here or here in a church, and those of you in the early session know what I'm talking about, right? Christians fight a lot, and Madison wanted to make sure, one of the things this Constitution was intended to do was that, religion would continue to make virtuous people, but religion needed to stay within its bounds. Religion needed to be contained in some kind of way. This is Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, explaining why the Constitution was the best government for a republic. The Constitution would help deal with the major problems that all republics deal with. And this is a problem of factions. Factions in contemporary terms would be understood as a special interest group on the peaceful side. On the negative side would be some kind of armed insurrection. And Madison, Jefferson, and many of the founders believed there's a long history of religion wanting to assume political power, wanting to take political power, becoming a force of violence and unrest and disruption in society. And so we need to make sure that doesn't happen. His argument in Federalist Paper number 10, and you can see where he singles out, religious sect may degenerate into a political faction, part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. Madison's argument was, as the country expands, the number of religious factions will expand. Denominations, the number of denominations will expand. As those denominations will expand, they're going to fight with each other, but because they're fighting with each other, no one of them is going to be able to take over the government. No one of them is going to be able to change the laws and then force their beliefs on everyone else. In other words, Madison believed the best check towards religious oppression was religious pluralism. And so while the founders believed that religion had an important role to play in public life, they were very clear that they didn't think any one particular religion should play that role. Religion in general need to fight with each other, battle with each other. And as they did, religion would not become that political problem that religion had perpetually had become in Europe. And so there's a wonderful kind of containment strategy here that Madison understands. You really have to understand the First Amendment through Article 6 and through Madison's number 10. if you want to talk about that later, we can. I don't necessarily like talking that much about the First Amendment, but I think that the more important thing is understanding what was actually going on at the time of the writing of the Constitution, and that was that religion was important for good political life. At the same time, religion needed to stay in its place. Religion needed to stay as much as possible out of politics, and we needed to especially encourage religious diversity. And so you would be saying, well, yeah, religious diversity among like Christian sects, right? Because it's not like there were Catholics or Muslims or Hindus or Jews in the country at the time, right? No, there were all those. Well, there were no atheists certainly at the time. Yeah, there were those too. So when they talked about religion, they meant all of those things. They meant all of those groups. They were quite clear on this fact. They weren't just saying, well, we want Christian diversity. Like, no, they wanted real religious diversity. So that's the first reason that we think that America was founded as a Christian nation. Is because we did have this Christian heritage. I'm going to, for sake of time, skip over these, but I guess it is worth asking, if we think that Washington was right, that religion is essential for producing moral and virtuous people, which makes for good government, then if you think that somehow we have become a less religious or less Christian nation, that does invite conversation about, well, where does that virtue come from then? How are people going to be virtuous if they're no longer religious? If church attendance is declining in the United States, if religious affiliation is declining in the United States, the rise of the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S, today is one of the fastest growing religious groups. Religious identification in the United States or nuns, the non-affiliated. Do we need to worry about this? Do we need to worry that we somehow will not be able to hold together as a virtuous nation? Okay, second reason we think that America was founded as a Christian nation is because very early on, Christians thought we should be. They wanted us to be. Not in a strictly cultural kind of sense, not in the way that Madison and Washington were generally fine with us being, but in an official, legal, and political sense. You might not think it's a big deal that the Constitution doesn't mention God, but many Christians at that time were very concerned that the Constitution didn't mention God. They were very worried about it. And from day one, they were trying to launch movements to rewrite the Constitution to make sure that Christianity would have some kind of special place in the United States, because they understood what the Constitution was doing, which was, knocking them politically, legally down a peg, establishing, a secular or at least a multi-faith nation. So Christians began organizing very early on to put pressure on the political system to recognize Christianity in some kind of official way. This has taken different forms since 1789. In the 19th century, the push to make Sunday a special day. Christians mobilized to fight against Sunday mail. Used to be mail on Sundays, and Christians thought that was kind of symbolically a problem, so they fought it. They actually lost that battle. I forget, it must have been sometime in the 20th century that we officially started that, but in the 19th century they couldn't get that done. One thing they could get done, between the 1880s and 1918, it was illegal to play baseball on Sundays. Guys, if you went out and played baseball on Sundays, even in a professional capacity, the cops would come and arrest you because you were violating the Sabbath. Strange, sounds strange, but no, it's true. So there were these kind of different markers, but probably the more famous, the more common ways in which Christians from very early on have tried to make Christianity official in a legal or political sense, meant in trying to rewrite the Constitution. One of the first great movements for this occurred during the Civil War. A group changed its name to the National Reform Association to kind of downplay its more sectarian nature. But certainly it was a sectarian mission that it was trying to accomplish. The preamble to our Constitution doesn't mention God. They wanted to replace it with this. They do not get it done. It doesn't happen. But they didn't stop. You can see there between 1894 and 2004, over 200 times constitutional amendments were introduced into Congress to make America a Christian nation in an official, legal, or political sense. Wanting to add the designation to our Constitution, whether it's rewriting the preamble or adding another amendment to the Constitution, which explicitly said the United States was a Christian nation. 200 times those were introduced, and how many times did they succeed? None. But Christians didn't stop fighting for it. This is what I call, and this is why I'm trying to help us reorient our thinking away from thinking of Christian nationalism as something that we were and we're not anymore, and thinking Christian nationalism more as something we never were. But nevertheless, Christians have been fighting for us to become. And still, 200 years later, are still fighting for us to become a Christian nation in an official, legal, and political sense. This is what I call the Christian nationalism project. That there have been many attempts throughout American history to try to get this done. We are still living in the remnants of the Christian nationalism project of the World War II and Cold War years. It's different. It was a different Christian nationalism than the Christian nationalism of the 19th century. The Christian nationalism of the 19th century recognized we're not a Christian nation, we don't have a Christian constitution, but we should. The Christian nationalism of the World War II years and after, the ones that you might have encountered in school or in your church or, I don't know, maybe here, is we were a Christian nation at our founding, and we aren't anymore, and we should get back to it. There, at least the 19th century one was based in reality. We aren't a Christian nation, but we should become one. The Christian nationalism project that arises during World War II and after is largely a fiction. We were a Christian nation. No, we're not. And yet building upon that mythology, creating mythology during these years, right? It's not simply that Christians of the World War II and the Cold War years and those years after, it's not simply that they're drawing upon some kind of Christian heritage, they're inventing that heritage in those years. Some of you might be thinking, well, how can you say we're not a Christian nation, right? I pledge allegiance, one nation under God, right? Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. But I'm going to take out a dollar bill. I'm going to show them, in God we trust, on that dollar bill, 1956. Well, my penny has it too, 1864. Right? All these things come well after the actual creation of the Constitution, as a part of the Christian nationalism project, as an attempt to, by Christians, to, in many ways, if they couldn't rewrite the Constitution, and they've tried to do that, they're still trying to do it. At least try to circumvent it. To try to pretend like the Constitution doesn't say what it actually says. And that we still, even despite what the Constitution says, we still are a Christian nation in an official, legal, or political sense. The Christian nationalism project continues on. And if you want to learn more about the invented nature, thinking of Christian nationalism as a project, there's a number of books that I can recommend. I probably should have put a bibliography on here or something. All you want in the middle of a semester is more books to read. I can recommend a number of texts to you. So, you can see it there. 2013, 32% of Americans still favor a Christian constitutional amendment, still favor making America officially a Christian nation. Why? Why are we still... Why do we keep still reinventing and reinvesting in this project? Why do we still just keep denying the actual history of our founding. Why do we keep having these fights and circulating around them? It's not because it's good history. It's certainly not because it's good theology. Because we think it makes for good politics. That phrase, America was founded as a Christian nation, is not a historical statement. It's not a theological statement. Neither history nor theology backs up that statement. That is a political statement that people make. It's a political statement that people began making in the 19th century, continued to make it even more earnestly after World War II, and many are still making it today. I did feel in some ways like I was preaching to the choir with this, because the reception to this debate in my 141 class this past fall was, it just seemed like very few students either cared about this issue or were willing to fight and say, yeah, we're a Christian nation, and a lot of them were just willing to abandon it. And so I'm really wondering kind of where the SAU student population is at over this particular question. But I would certainly like to move the conversation away from this, the question that is perpetually asked, why do we think, was America founded as a Christian nation? I don't think we need to take that up anymore. I think that very question ends up circumventing or undercutting the debate. Because again, that's not a historical statement. It's not a theological statement. It's a political statement. And we could go beyond just simply asking why do we think America's a Christian nation, and think about some reasons why we should just give up on the Christian nationalism project itself. And I won't elaborate on those. You can read them for yourselves. What I'd like to do now is open it up for questions, comments, shoe throwing if necessary. All right, thank you. Question? Yes.
So, understanding that we're founded as a Christian nation, but we're founded by Christians and in a largely Christian society. You brought up earlier the concern that as we abandon that culture, that things start to fall apart that worked maybe when we founded the country, that doesn't start to unravel. And one thing I think of is capitalism, where we talk about income inequality and how that's such a huge problem. And capitalism works if people are self-interested, but there's limits to their self-interest and a sense of common good. So
and the question is, because the assumption of Washington in his farewell address, and the assumption of many Americans at that time, is that the only source of virtue is religious belief. And for some of them, probably Washington, less so Washington. But for, say, those Congregationalists in Massachusetts, it wasn't simply any old religion will do. It's the Christian religion specifically that has to do this. But it is an open question. Is the only source for morality and virtue, does it have to come from religion? And specifically, does it have to come from the Christian religion? What does history teach us? Are there no virtuous Muslims? Is there no moral tradition in Hinduism? Are atheists not good people? Can you not derive a sense of self-sacrifice and care and love for one's neighbor from some kind of natural morality? They were already doing it at the time. The Enlightenment was largely about trying to get away from sectarian forms of religion and trying to figure out how to do things apart from religion, including how to be virtuous. This is why this kind of last statement, this is what Washington is getting at. Let us, with caution, indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Because what that suggests to us is that there were people at that time, including Washington's own friends, who were saying, hey, you know what? Morality can be maintained without religion. As I said, there were atheists at that time who were still good people, who were saying, yeah, you don't need to be religious to be good. So I guess that's what I would do with that.
Washington seems to be saying, though, that in his last line that national morality may not be able to prevail. If I'm reading this correctly, I may not be.
Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail, an exclusion of religious principle. He himself is skeptical, right? But he's not saying it's impossible. You know, and that's what's, I think, really important about this, is because, you know, he's got people in his own inner circle, like Ben Franklin, for instance, who are not religious individuals. Yet, you read Ben Franklin's autobiography, it's pretty clear he's working towards some kind of more attempted morality, not one he practiced himself, but one that he thought other people should be practicing, right? He was very much a do as I say, not as I do kind of guy. You know, so, but even at this time, even 200 years ago, part of the Enlightenment project was trying to figure out how you can separate religion and morality and religion and virtue. You know, and if you take a philosophy class here, or you go talk to a philosopher, they'll tell you, yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can derive morality and virtue apart from religion, certainly apart from the Christian religion. Hopefully that answered. Yes.
I noticed, like, the general population is less than half of people believe that, like, we should be a Christian nation still. And yet, like, for me personally, growing up in, like, public schools and all that, I still taught that we were a Christian nation and, like, all this, all that. Is that more
Yeah, and it could just be confusion of terms, right? It's very likely that when somebody says, you know, we were founded as a Christian nation, what they mean is, well, you know, our leaders were Christians. Or that, you know, 80% of our population went to church. Or that we had, in violation of the Constitution, states maintained religious establishments. So that might be very well what they mean. What I'm saying is, whatever people mean when they use the term Christian nationalism, that phrase, Christian nationalism, and the claim America was founded as a Christian nation, always ends up in the hands of those people who think that the country was Christian in an official, legal, and political sense, right? You know, so if we're keeping it at the level of culture, yeah, we were founded as a Christian nation, meaning that our culture at the time was Christian, then that's a safe historical statement. But the problem is when we use instead of putting it that way, yeah, that's what I would suggest, is that's the way we should put it. At the time of our founding, we had a strong Christian heritage. Our leaders were Christian, and they believed that, you know, religion was important for good civic life. That's the way we should be talking about it. Instead, we say we are a Christian nation, and immediately we begin excluding all the people at that time who weren't Christian, and we exclude all those people since that time and today who aren't those things, and we end up in the hands of a Roy Moore. Look, this guy was a judge, a part of the legal system. He was bound under Article 6, and yet he says Muslims can't serve in the U.S. Congress because they can't swear on a Bible. You know, how do we get to this point that history and politics are so messed up that we can produce that kind of absurdity in our national life? And the problem, you know, and thankfully, because I was trying to, you know, look around and say, you know, was Moore's view that Muslims shouldn't be able to serve in Congress because they can't swear in the Bible? Is that, you know, is there like a sizable number of Americans who believe that too? And thankfully the answer is no. The closest I could find is that pollsters in the last 5 years or so have asked Americans, hey, if you knew that somebody was running for Congress and they were a Muslim, or if you knew that they were an atheist, would you be equally likely to vote for them, more likely to vote for them, or less likely to vote for them? And a sizable number of respondents said we would be less likely to vote for them. So, you know, even though there's not many of a kind of true and blue Roy Moore thinkers out there, their belief has trickled out into the general population, suggesting that if you're a Muslim, if you're an atheist, you still have less of a place in our national life, in our government, right? And again, Article 6 of the Constitution couldn't have been any clearer in that question. And it's frustrating as a historian, it's frustrating as a Christian who takes the transnationality of the church seriously. It's frustrating that we're still here. It's frustrating that we're still at this place. And I'm wondering what it's going to take to finally close the door on the Christian nationalism project.
Do you think, like, because I know there's a lot of people out there who do, like, buy into the construct of the Christian nation, but they also are advocates for religious freedom, probably honestly mostly for their own, like, benefit. But
Yeah.
do you think that there's inherently contradiction when someone says, well, we're a Christian nation, you know, but we're okay with other religions being here, but we are a Christian nation?
You know, and again, I guess I would want to press those people on what are you getting out of making the claim that we're a Christian nation, right? Are you saying we're a Christian nation today? That probably still holds up. I mean, I think 75% of Americans still identify as Christian. As much as church attendance and membership declined, it's still fairly high in terms of the Western world. So you still could, I guess, make that claim that in terms of identification, if we think of Christianity as kind of an identity, it does seem to be that Christianity is becoming more or returning to be a form of ethnic identity, more so than any kind of genuine theological or religious orientation. I guess I wonder what people are getting out of that, right? It's one thing to say, we had this Christian heritage. Does that mean we still have it today intact? The family values of 1789 are still the family values of 2017. Has there been any loss? I didn't want to get into it at a time because I didn't want to get into questions, but this is something that I did want to point out, is that it does seem that as the church gained an institutional vitality in the 19th and 20th centuries, that its moral authority has tended to become more and more circumscribed. And I would suggest that's a paradox. What I mean by institutional vitality is, our church services today are probably as better as they've ever been in this country, right? I would put up your chapel service against a congregational service from 1789 any day. You guys are going to win, right? Seriously, much more energy, much more, you're probably even content going into that, right? It's the difference between a Tom Brady touchdown catch and a Nick Foles touchdown catch. There's no I'm glad a number of you know what I'm talking about. There's no comparison there. And yet, for all of our sophistication, for all the energy that we bring to our services and our religious expressions, can we honestly say that Christianity today carries the moral weight that it did back in the 1780s or 1790s when the Constitution was written? So it does seem to be a loss. And I guess, Lucas, that's where I really would wonder, is that person pretending like there hasn't been that loss?
I feel like, though, it comes from that the first session, when the other Mark was talking about that marriage of American virtue with what Christian virtue may be, which presses on the question of, do those things always align, or is there some weird marriage there? Because I think people look at, well, these American values are Christian values, and maybe not from like a scriptural or like a historically Christian point of view, but from, well, I don't know a world different where freedom and liberty aren't Christian values. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think
right.
what
That's a good point.
I think what they're saying then in that sense is like, well, the virtues that are here are Christian virtues. So what do you mean it's not a Christian nation? These are the things that I believe religiously. So maybe that's my question then is like, well, if they're also saying that freedom of religion is one of those. Does that just mean freedom of religion for themselves, or does that mean freedom of religion for everyone?
Yeah, and that's why the Christian Nationalism Project has been so powerful since World War II, and why it's so hard to imagining it ever ending, is that it just keeps producing overlaps between national identity, between Christian identity, practices, symbols. It just keeps getting regenerated, again and again. But I mean, to your point, when you actually press somebody, what do you mean we're a Christian nation and yet we have religious freedom? When you actually press somebody to really explain that, that's when the Christian Nationalism Project kind of collapses, to me. And that's when it would be good for us to begin to clarify our language. And so, to me, again, the language, the discourse of Christian nationalism is one that should be shut down in terms of history and theology. The only reason that it's maintained is because there are a number of Christians out there who think that this makes for a good political strategy. And in the 1980s it was. It's become a lot less so now, but I can remember the rallying cry where we were a Christian nation. We're not anymore. We've lost that. We've got to bring the nation back to God. We've got to get back to God, and so Christians need to get involved in politics, and do all those things. And I'm not saying Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, but maybe there's other reasons for Christians to be involved in politics than trying to take the nation back for God. And really just ignoring how different our country has become since 1965. 1965 is when we opened up our immigration system. And that's when you really begin to see large numbers of Asians, Africans, South Americans being able to come into our country in large numbers and really change the makeup of our country. And yet we continue to insist that we're somehow a Christian nation like pre-1965. It does seem that it would be better for Christians to start making the adjustments to the world, to a post-1965 world. Whether we want to call that a post-Christian society or not, I don't know. I think one more question, because I'm not sure when we're supposed to be done, but don't want to cut you guys short on lunch.
So I'm just gonna make the assumption that the Christian nationalism comes from one political party in particular, and so how
It's become a partisan issue.
Yeah.
It wasn't always, but it's
so
a partisan
how
issue.
would politics make that shift if that was a thing we took on, we are a Christian nation, if in general not all Christians would
Yeah.
fall under one political party in the first place, how would that even change the way we operated as a country?
It could come from both sides. Changes on both sides. It's going to have to be Republican voters and the people who run on the Republican tickets deciding, we're not going to mobilize on the basis of this Christian nationalism thing anymore. It's just it's not worth it's not worth the costs, right? It's not worth the cost of that discourse. We're not going to do that anymore. Republicans were not, for much of their history, were not the party of Christian nationalism, and so let them be so again. Conversely, a lot of members of the Democratic Party are those who tend to move towards this. Well, there was no religion at the founding, and Christianity wasn't there, and our leaders weren't Christian; they were deists, and all those kinds of things. And they're getting history wrong too. So the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out how to, or I should say that they should. I would like to see the Democratic Party figure out how to deal with religion in a more responsible kind of way. So I think both sides have some probably repenting to get right on the side of history and theology. And I'm not hopeful. I'm not hopeful it's going to happen, right? I'm not hopeful. I think the Christian Nationalism Project is going to continue, in part because the institutions of Christian nationalism remain fairly well intact. The Christian day schools. Not all Christian day schools perpetuate this idea, but most do. The Christian publishers, Wall Builders and David Barton. And when David Barton eventually, we think he'll die, he probably won't be resurrected, he'll die, and then, but there'll be a new David Barton rise up to be that person who continues to perpetuate this idea that we are a Christian nation in the official legal and political sense, right? So look, let me speak personally. The first research paper I wrote as an undergraduate was a 50-page paper critiquing this idea of America as a Christian nation, right? And, I completed it. I'm like, okay, we're done, right? I've solved the problem. Case closed. Well, here it is like 25 years later. And it's still the same thing. It's still all the conversation gravitating around, was America founded as a Christian nation? America was founded as a Christian nation. Again and again and again. And so I'm skeptical that we're going to be able to break out of the stranglehold of the Christian nationalism project. But, hopefully you guys at least will ask some different questions in the future. Thanks.